Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Welcome, everybody, on this gloriously spring day in the new weather times, I guess. I know. It is an honor to introduce Professor Jessica O'Reilly, who is an associate professor in international studies, home department, also a friend and colleague there. So I'm very delighted that you've decided to join us today. Professor O'Reilly is an environmental anthropologist who studies how scientists and policymakers participate in environmental management, both in regards to specifically Antarctic environment, but also global climate change. Through participant observation and ethnographic interviews, she examines how people and ideas in science and policy interact, and how experts make decisions about matters of concern, and how relationships with the environment inform knowledge production. She's traveled and conducted research widely, including actually in Antarctica, but also New Zealand, and spent many hours at the Conference on the Parties, the Global Climate Change Summit, where she is the really only academic with observer status who also brings students to the COP every year, which is just a really amazing both opportunity for the students, but at some point, hopefully opportunity for some other faculty to join you. I'm just kidding. So I'm really delighted to introduce Jessie. Her paper today is "The Curve and Ethnography of Projecting Sea Level Rise Under Uncertainty." I'll let you go from there. We'll handle any clarifying questions during the first 10-15 minutes presentation, and then I'll keep a queue after that. Scott, can you help us online a little bit? All right, awesome, great, thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be invited to present my research and to hear your thoughts on it. Really looking forward to this. I do want to say hello to my co-author, who is joined us via Zoom, Michael Oppenheimer from Princeton. And the access that I have to the IPCC would not be possible without Michael. So maybe I'll get into the history of this project in a moment and bring him into that. And I'm particularly glad here because he can help me with the science questions that like to hold the ideas about ice sheet dynamics in my head. It slips out really quickly as an anthropologist. It's icy, slippery. Yeah, we're both really looking forward to your feedback. We're hoping to target this to interdisciplinary environmental journal, perhaps global environmental change. If you have other suggestions, we would love to hear those as well. So I have been told I have 15-20 minutes to talk, and I've got my notes here. I'm going to talk about first, the way that this paper is part of a broader project, both historically and intellectually. And then for the second part of my remarks, I will talk about the article, and then I will open it up for questions. So first, this paper is part of a broader project historically. I was hired as a postdoc by Michael Oppenheimer and historian of science Naomi Oreskes to study the history of projections of what's going to happen to the West Antarctic ice sheet. And I was uniquely situated. I had never had so many people forward a job call to me as that particular postdoc that was looking for someone who looked at the cultural and historical dynamics of the West Antarctic ice sheet. I had just completed my dissertation on Antarctic scientists and how they contribute to environmental decision-making in the Antarctic Treaty System. So I'd been to Antarctica, I'd been to the Antarctic Treaty. I continue to go to the Antarctic Treaty. I now I'm not a researcher, but I I participate with the US delegation as their environmental advisor. So I came with some Antarctic experience into this incredible postdoc where, and Michael can correct all of this, but I see that he is on mute. Michael, it has a really unique position in the IPCC. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the science body. So they're producing these science assessments. The UNFCCC is the political side of things. And I go to both, and they both have CC. IPCC, my team is the only group of researchers ever allowed into the IPCC meetings. The UNFCCC, there are plenty of researchers there, but we're one of the very few universities that send students, especially undergraduates. And Beatriz went to Egypt at COP27 and Dubai at COP28. So she's one of our IU student delegates, but a PhD student. So I'm kind of looking at the science policy interaction, and particularly with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, what Michael and Naomi hired me to do in particular, there had been this kind of messy situation with sea level rise projections in AR4, the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Michael has been involved in every single IPCC assessment report since the first one. So the sixth just ended. We'll see if he goes on to AR7. I think he should, just to keep his streak going. But in AR4, what had happened was the sea level rise projections they ended up not including what's called rapid dynamical flow. Colloquially, this is called ice sheet collapse. But it doesn't collapse like you would expect in a movie, but it happens really rapidly. If you're thinking in terms of, we use this pace like at a glacial pace. This happened, this is not, it's glaciers, but it's not what you would expect from a glacial pace. Rapid over 100 or 200 years. But you can't stop it once it goes. It's not linear. It just cascades into the ocean. And this ice sheets hold a lot of potential sea level rise. So the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is where a lot of the uncertainty comes from, is a marine ice sheet. So it's interacting with the ocean, and that has about 5 meters of potential sea level rise. Greenland ice sheet has about 5 meters of sea level rise. The East Antarctic ice sheet has 50 or 60 meters, but I like to tell my students that if we get to that point, we've already eradicated ourselves through other means, so we don't need to worry about that one. So for AR4, I interviewed a bunch of the IPCC authors after the fact. So I was interested in learning why they had made this decision to not include this low likelihood but high impact event that really was starting to come out in some research as increasingly likely. Though the likelihood was still low, it wasn't. Just a few years before that, I had learned from my Antarctic science interlocutors that the Antarctic ice sheet was gaining mass. That there was more snow falling on it because it was a little warmer. Antarctica is the driest continent, and it was allowing a little more moisture and a little more precipitation. And so really in that period of, in the 2000s, it became apparent that the ice sheet was actually losing mass pretty rapidly in some areas, and doing some sort of hinting. This is thinning, spreading, particularly at Waite's Glacier. So I interviewed people involved in making decisions about how to communicate that, and making that decision to leave that out, or at least they tucked it away in a footnote. And we published that in a few different venues. So historically, I've been working with ice sheet scientists in the IPCC for 15 years, since 2008. So I had a little bit of information coming into this. But even in that first meeting, one of the first times I met with Michael, I talked about trying to gain research access to the IPCC to actually sit in the meetings while they were happening. Because as you probably know, after you've finished writing something and then you experience how the public picks it up or how your colleagues remark on it, you know, it changes your how you narrate the experience. So this project instead for the 6th assessment report, and if you want to know what happened in AR5, we can do that in the questions. I had access. And again, much of this is thanks to Michael. It triggered a whole sort of expert meeting and process through the IPCC. They had to have, you know, they had to have the governments approve it. And then and then once we got the procedures in place, we had to submit our project. And I know Michael did some lobbying with his, you know, people he knows in the State Department to get our project approved. But then he took up an author position in AR6, and I was alone. Not really, but I and our postdoc team were the researchers, and Michael and I couldn't talk about this project for a couple of years until all of the reports were out. But now we've written this about the 6th assessment, and I was able to go to every lead author meeting. This paper focuses on working group 1, so there were 4 meetings, and I interviewed the chapter 9 authors, the Sea Level Rise chapter authors, at each of these meetings. So that means, like, at the beginning, they're all optimistic, they're excited, they're looking forward to it. It's fun to meet new people and learn new science. And then, as you know, with any group project, things go sideways. There are arguments, and these are, you know, on deeply held expert views, different disciplinary positions, and then personalities as well. And so, so being able to interview and interact with these folks at intervals throughout the process was really fascinating, to get to capture the highs and lows of the process in situ, instead of just sort of packaged at the end where we all sort of tell ourselves stories about how things went okay, or you hold on to a grudge or something like that. So that was really fascinating to get to do that. I had 100% uptake. So every single author on this chapter was interviewed for this project, including the person who quit. And that was that's an amazing amount of access. I didn't have that. I actually had that with my working group 2 chapter as well. And then with working group 3, if we want to get into comparing the working groups, happy to talk about that too. But having 100% participation throughout the entire process, including when there was a COVID pandemic, they all still came back for their Zoom interviews, because I did have quite a bit of dropping there, but not with this chapter. Probably part of it is they had read the work and knew that kind of had an idea of what I was up to. But also I just want to acknowledge that these are extremely reflective and reflexive scientists, very open to critique, very willing to improve their science and the assessment process through sort of, I don't want to say radical transparency, but through transparency. And this also varied among the working groups as well. And of course, among different people's personalities. So, so that's the history. So intellectually, this is a book project. And so it will, we hope to submit it for publication in a journal, but it's also a chapter in a book. And this is, well, I don't need to get into that too much. I just want to make 3 points about the broader intellectual trajectory of this as a book project. So first, I used to write to show the social side of the IPCC as something that is happening in addition to scientific assessment. because it wasn't talked about very much, that the social dynamics piece was not explicit. I think in addition to the science and the technical side. But this has developed over the 15 years I've been studying this. And now I would argue that the social side of the IPCC, including the fact that it goes through government review and that the authors are required to be diverse and representative of world regions, career stage, gender, and so on, expertise, of course, too. So I think the social side is a key strength, and if perhaps the key strength of the IPCC. It's something that makes the science robust, politically defensible, scientifically authoritative. And so I'm coming at it from that perspective. Second, this government side or the diplomatic side. In my Antarctic work, in my book about Antarctica, my key argument there is that these people working on science policy interfaces strategically or sort of using bricolage, like making do. So sort of not strategically, but trying to get agreements and get science out in a way that's approvable. They borrow techniques from scientific practice and what they've learned in their disciplinary training, how to work on group projects, how to do collaborative authorship, that sort of stuff, along with techniques from diplomacy, because they're much closer to international governance than you usually are in your lab. And so they may borrow particularly the leaders who know that they have to help translate the assessment to governments in order to get it approved, are really good negotiators and sometimes flow between UNFCCC and IPCC. And another piece of that is about scientists learning to anticipate government reactions. What's gonna make some governments blow their lids? What's not gonna be approvable? And how can they, of course, their primary goal is to maintain scientific integrity. There's never a question of that. But you can frame the science and frame these important results and this really important assessment in a way that is approvable. And anticipating that. And so there are some people who really do a lot of that anticipation and others who want to do the science first and ignore the governments, which is another completely legible way of doing this. So that's the diplomatic side. So that's point 2. Point 1 was the social side. All right, finally, this more explicit connection to the Paris Agreement in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the global stocktake. So just in case we don't know everything about the Paris Agreement, it is it's sort of it's a pledge and review system where countries put forth their nationally determined contributions, and then they review these in a iterative process called the global stocktake every 5 years, and then they resubmit nationally determined contributions, and they're supposed to raise ambition every time they do so. And they can also, of course, technologies are cheaper at that point, and policies are more mature and already implemented, so ambition can increase. This year in Dubai, the parties to the UNFCCC completed the first global stocktake. And I'm going to contend, and I've been chatting with some of my political science friends, particularly Hannah Hughes in the UK, who's been talking about this working surprisingly well. That it's that there's good reason to be optimistic about it, especially if you see what's happening on the IPCC side, some governments really scrambling to slow the IPCC down. And there's been this sort of push to pair IPCC reports with the global stocktake. And now there is a backlash. It's intensifying this pushback to decouple IPCC, even though UNFCCC is supposed to be their primary audience, to decouple their timeline. And of course, our argument said out loud is they need 7 years instead to produce high quality reports. But in tacitly, what's happening is that slows down not only IPCC and its policy relevance, but also slows down the UNFCCC and its ability to take the most robust international climate science assessment into account in the next global stocktake. So that's a hypothesis, and it's coming from conversations with colleagues. But that's maybe something to think about for this next assessment report. Okay, on to the article. And I didn't know, I'm doing good filling up the time, I think. So I'll be pretty quick. I thought it was 5 or 10 minutes and I was told 15, 20. So I'm sure most of you read this. So the article has 2 primary sections, and then this main argument. So the main argument is about the curve as a figurative ecology. And we're really looking into the social construction of numbers, this idea of writing numbers, this idea of number ecologies that exist in social and epistemic as well as expert spaces. And I just want to say a note, because I know we have a diverse group here, that this kind of work, I think everyone who does qualitative research understands this explicitly and implicitly, that there is a lot of social labor that goes into producing these numbers and these figures. And we're trying to make it apparent here. As a contribution to increasing the robustness of scientific assessments and understanding how the process works, and maybe some points where it could be strengthened. So sort of what they may have done well from an improvised standpoint could be standardized. So we do this in 2 parts. We look at the social and epistemic challenges for part 1. So how do experts deal with matters of deep uncertainty or ambiguity? How do they differentiate from previous assessments? Because now we're in an assessment economy where people are always, these reports are in a chain, stuff came before and stuff's gonna come after. Something has to be new, but nonetheless not too new. Coming up, dealing with new knowledge, and in this case, it's Mickey, the marine ice cliff instability, and this Pollard and DeCanto set of papers that was really challenging for the assessors to deal with. And then just dealing with representing the diverse expert communities within the chapter. So the IPCC and even a chapter, they're not an epistemic community. They're sort of stakeholders of multiple epistemic communities. So they're not already ready to work without much friction. And then we talked about how they solved these challenges with technical and social tools. So we looked at emulators, drawing the curve. That, of course, is the biggest part of the story, and dealing with the fact that there are real deadlines. These aren't sort of other kinds of publication deadlines that are extendable into, yeah. That they actually had to do something by a certain time. So see the figure here, and maybe I'll open to Michael in a moment if he has things to correct or add. But really, this is a story of this figure here that Chapter 9 authors worked on for 4 years to draw these lines. And these dotted lines really represent what was missing in the 4th assessment report. These are projections, for the first time, not hidden in a footnote or maybe a little bit of text. In a chapter, well, that's a whole nother, I won't get into that, but they're here in the summary for policymakers, like elevated about as high up as you can get. For the first time, they made it in a colored figure. There's a text box, and really brought it to the forefront in a way because they think this information is really important. Because decision makers don't want to plan for the mid-range of sea level rise. That's a waste of money. They want to plan if they're building infrastructure that's supposed to last a century or two. They might want to be planning for these higher end projections, even if it's a low probability of occurring. So it was an innovation in the sixth assessment report. And if I may, Michael, what would
Yep.
you like to add?
Well, first I want to add that I don't know anybody else who could have pulled this off but you. It was an amazing feat. I mean, you know, I know nothing about, I'm not a social scientist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a physical scientist. I had to get used to the whole idea of the research strategy that you were developing. But I did know I had lived with IPCC for, you know, more than 30 years. And, you know, you talk about anthropologists going off and trying to get inside indigenous communities somewhere else. And this group is, I'm sure, has its own level of difficulty in trying to penetrate. And, you know, certainly somebody who had to get acculturated to them over time, and yet is part of the same culture. It could not have been easy. You had all this experience beforehand, which I must have served you very well. But I'm amazed. I'm amazed at what you got out of people, and I don't mean that in, you know, like you know, pulled it out of them accident, or had a strategy for saying things they might not have ordinarily said. But I was just bowled over by a lot of the, you know, a lot of the quotes that you were able to extract from people. And so, you know, kudos to you in getting this done. It it's always been a dream of mine to try to understand, after sitting in rooms with scientists discussing matters of fact for, you know, my whole career now, more than 50 years. I just, you know, I got to the point before we started this project where I had a need to really understand how people have the confidence, the arrogance, and the ability to reach consensus, even getting beyond the arrogance, to be able to make big factual statements about the world, and in addition, have them be relevant, it turns out, to something really important, like how decisions are made about our lives by others. And so this is also coming to fruition of something that I would have wanted to see done decades ago, but had no idea that it was even possible to do anything like this, which says something about the weakness of literature, or I should say that scientists don't even know there is literature half the time, where people have actually taken a scholarly approach to what they think, and mostly they don't care, I think, is another part of the problem. So there's a whole story in here about educating scientists in addition to what you got done. So anyway, that's all I want to say about that. You know, what you said about the ice sheets, I couldn't find a mistake in it, so that's good. And I just say that, from the importance of this work from a scientific point of view is, as we get deeper into problems that involve the whole Earth system and that are therefore very uncertain because they involve interactions of different types of physical systems with different types of biological systems, and ultimately with the human system, uncertainty is always the primary theme in people's minds as IPCC scientists and other scientists dealing with this, and how you talk about uncertainty, because the very existence of uncertainty demands, you know, a different kind of language than scientists are used to speaking, and how you can speak it and at the same time get other people who aren't scientists to understand that you know something, even if you're saying and often emphasize what we don't know. That's critically important to us making any progress on public policy in this dimension. And at a time when science is under attack, as are a lot of institutions in our society. I think this kind of work will prove in the end to be critically important to getting people ultimately to understand what scientists do, that they are not, for pulling them off the pedestal, but that doesn't mean you have to bury them underground, because they're people. They're just approaching things in a very human way, and that's not something to be put aside, which was what most scientists try to distance themselves from that. I think it's important not to. End of speech.
Okay. So thank you. So we're gonna open it up to questions now. As I mentioned, I will keep the queue in the room, and in keeping with tradition, we would love for a graduate student to ask the first question. Wonderful. And then I will, all right, go ahead.
Hi, Jessie. I love your work and I would love to hear you talk always. I wanted to ask a little bit more about these ethnographic elements of studying with elites and studying with intellectual elites, and in like anthropological literature in that sometimes it says like how much like what is the question or challenge that like a scientist gets to you and you're interviewing them, like how much you know about the science here, if you have kind of little, can say a little bit about that. And also a little bit more about the ethnographic moments of, for example, how certain countries wanted to slow down, like the assessment to go. How do they do that, right?
Should we take these one?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Until we get to the very end. Then we'll do it.
Thanks, Beatrice. Great questions. Yeah, so, yep, so I'm studying up or maybe studying across. I would contend these folks are more elite than I am. But they're professors, so in some ways studying across. They, first of all, IPCC authors actually really dislike being called elite. So one of my collaborators wrote the word elite in her conclusion, and actually multiple IPCC authors have talked to me about that and are concerned that they, these are people with their nose to the ground, working on their models and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, they are, right? So straddling that a little bit. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've worked with indigenous people or local communities. I started my fieldwork in Indonesia with much more marginalized people than this. Of course, there's levels of protection that as anthropologists, we have to provide for marginalized people in our studies. And with the IPCC, much of that is provided for them through their institutions. Also, they're very happy to filter themselves in interviews and that sort of thing. So there's that piece too. Nonetheless, there are people who are socially marginalized in the chapter, if we're just looking at that group, and others from places or positions that are more powerful. So I think it really holds. I really expected to be an anthropologist. Like it started in Antarctica. I thought I was going to be outside a lot and camping. And now it's a bunch of suits. Just turned out that's where the knowledge I needed to get was. But that's where the answers to my questions are. The question about countries slowing down. I know this is going to be recorded and it's okay. I've published it before as well. Sometimes people are more comfortable saying one party or a couple of parties. But there's a bloc led by Saudi Arabia and India and China who slow down the process using really simple tactics and techniques. So slow down the approval plenaries of these reports and then and raise all kinds of questions and doubts about the IPCC reports. In some ways, it's completely understandable that they do this. India, for example, their review comments aren't taken into account, like review comments from the United States or from Germany, that they have to push back a little more in diplomatic spaces. So that makes complete sense. At the same time, it can, like, these meetings, they'll run all night, due to these interventions, raising repeated concerns about things like model scenarios, which very much should be questioned. But these procedural tactics, and then to solve these problems in the report, they'll add footnotes and, maybe put a data table under a figure that all of a sudden makes something that looks really clear, all of a sudden have this big, like, Frankenstein jumble at the end of it. And then they go to the UNFCCC and are like, how can we even understand this IPCC report? Even though it was the concerns that they raised and the effects that they had in the report. It's not just those three countries, but particularly Saudi Arabia and India are the most sophisticated at this. And they have multiple reasons why, and maybe not in the same basket. Maybe one country wants more time to develop using the fossil fuel resources they have, and maybe another country wants to slow this transition down as much as possible so that they can transition their oil-based economy to renewables as smoothly as possible.
I have a question if we're, and then,
No, feel free. So yeah, I think.
okay, and then, okay, oh, great, then never mind, I'm gonna be quiet.
No, it's good.
And we'll go Scott, Bernie, and then Jamie,
Oh, yeah.
and then I'll do at the end.
First off, how do we get to Antarctica? I've always wanted to go there. We need a field trip.
But
I mean, come on, right?
yeah.
No, just a really quick one. I remember when the Paris Agreement came out, it was kind of held up as this kind of model of polycentrism and maybe kind of the way forward to address different global collective action challenges. And it sounds like from what you were saying, maybe a success, at least for a while, except for this, more recent pushback. And of course, who knows what'll happen with the elections later this year here, right? But I'm wondering, like, how fragile is that model and that progress? And could that call into question, the utility of this as we think about other, issues? That's what's in the back of my mind. I'm curious if you have any reflections on that,
Yeah.
the resilience, I suppose, of
Yeah.
that structure.
I mean, we, the United States, are the big, we're the unpredictable ones, because we just entered, I mean, the whole thing was negotiated under the Clean Air Act and the original UNFCCC. That was designed that way so that we could just enter with executive order. But of course, we were able to leave with the same and come back. And so we're not reliable actors, and we're a pretty significant actor in this. So that piece, I'm really nervous about. In terms of polycentrism, I think the COP and the Paris Agreement is a success. The global stocktake, for example, is a multi-year process, especially in year one. So it was year two that just concluded. They bring in different that's very conversational, iterative. It's not what you would expect from a UN negotiation. There's a lot of participation, inclusion, different ideas. And you do see some of those trickle into cover decisions and things like that, with varying rates of success. And part of it depends on the topic and if there's a window of opportunity, but civil society is really good at and increasingly nimble at that. And I think that's really important when we have an unreliable United States and sort of a laggard, the international piece is sort of slower than where we see acting in the other parts of the world. And so when President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Agreement, civil society and non-state actors, state governments, that sort of thing, universities, religious organizations, tribal organizations, businesses, really filled the void. I mean, they had incredible growth in fundraising and participation, in getting Walmart to put their climate targets out, that meet the Paris Agreement. So I think it's robust for now, but that doesn't mean that there aren't pretty immediate threats to it.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and we can talk more about Antarctica.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do that. Who wants to join?
Yes, just gotta get a cruise ship and
Sure.
head down. No problem. We can do this.
Workshop excursion, right?
Heck,
Can we make it an addendum to WOW 7?
yeah, right. Yes.
Wow.
We'll get back to you on that one.
So when I was reading the paper, one of the things that I was thinking was, let's get out of climate change. Is there another initiative like this that some other person like you is studying that is this big? And one of the things I thought about was disease. And you know, we've got all kinds of things, jumping out of this thing, and getting policy, thinking about where disease is going is, but I didn't know if that was a good example. See, I'm thinking of CDC in the United States, but then there's all the worldwide stuff going on.
Yes, I can't think of anyone off the top of my head, but I know there are institutional ethnographers who work in these spaces. They might not all be anthropologists, but our sort of club of social scientists.
Let's call them social scientists.
Yes, we'll just call it that. Yeah, so there are people working, there's some really great accounts of negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, which was also a really unusual UN process, very participatory. Definitely in WHO. I don't know if CDC, American institutions are actually harder to access than intergovernmental. Although one of the authors of our 2019 book, Discerning Experts, he followed the National Academy of Sciences reports process and got to observe all of that. And they have a lot of different topics beyond climate change. So yeah, it's small. Often those folks, they're affiliated with some discipline and science studies for producing knowledge. Yeah, it's very small and hard to find people. But.
Yeah, in fact, follow up on that because you're in the Hamilton School, which is, I guess, not where I expect this to be necessarily.
Where would you expect it to be?
More likely in O'Neill. But I was thinking at other universities, where would this kind of work? Because you don't want to think of it as just in a small department. It's big.
Right. Yeah, yeah, so we've got a few universities that have climate and sustainability schools. And so, yeah, they're housed there. But yeah, this isn't traditional anthropology. And so that might make sense why I'm in an international studies department then, because I'm articulating with institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, I was, this is a really cool project. And I was wondering about like some of the dynamics between the actors in the room. Which ones did you find had more, did any particular person or personality or even type of hat they wore, like enable one person's opinions on things to be able to dominate the group? Like, were those who were better, being political players as well as scientists, for instance?
Yes, I could go on and on about this. Right, and there's not like one thing that allows, there are factions of people. They're really good communicators. They're really people who are really good on emotional registers and empathetic. That was something really interesting about this chapter 9. The coordinating lead authors, who are sort of the 3 people in charge of all the others, or of getting actually they're not in charge of the people, but in charge of the final chapter, were really empathetic human beings. And I think that was, and they were very serious about process and making sure people were heard, even if they weren't the loudmouths. So thinking up procedures, and then they modified those for Zoom because they had a bunch of hand signals that they used to to measure agreement or disagreement. And so yeah, there were a lot of ways, but you could see, I mean, in the article, it breaks down sometimes. Like sometimes people like, cried through the interview, which is fine too. Like you can be crying and making your point. Like some people just need to let it, people let it out in different ways. Sometimes people like held on to their anger and like let it out on me during their interviews. So but yeah, so I think the leadership was really important here. And following around, because each of my research team, we each like followed a chapter at each working group. And some of these chapters were toxic and they were not doing what this group was able to do. And a lot of it was social dynamics, leadership, the skill of the CLAs. And Michael's had that position before, and he's talked about his techniques for reaching agreement. So yeah, it's very multifaceted, but yeah, I'm super nosy and was really always interested in that.
Okay, I'm gonna take my private and ask my question really quick, and then, and you may have a quick answer to it, so we'll see, and then we've got, Gustavo and. My question is, so this is a really cool idea about sort of the social process of communicating uncertainty, is kind of the way I can think about it. And so one thing that would be helpful just in the paper early on, as you pointed out, I made a few mistakes in your introduction about like sort of different groups that you're sort of speaking to. And I was actually thinking one thing that would be helpful for those of us that make those kind of mistakes regularly is how many people are reading these assessment reports? What are the kinds of consequences of this kind of graph for policymakers, for binding agreements, et cetera? It would be super helpful in the introduction.
Right.
People understand why it's so important to talk about the social process of communicating uncertainty. And then my broader question, and I'm curious if Gustavo is going to agree with me or disagree with me on this, is about throughout your paper, you mentioned primarily uncertainty. And there are a few points where you mentioned risk. And I'm curious to what extent there were conversations or discussions about A, the difference between the two of them, and B, why or under what conditions scientists that you interviewed would find it more or less compelling to talk about one or the other.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, I would say the readership's really broad and big. And this figure will be shown, I mean, for the next 6 years in a lot of like science overview talks about climate change, but it was brought up in screens at the political negotiations as foundational knowledge. So they're framing it for the next 5 to 7 years. Risk, I could go on and on about. One of my collaborators, Mark Vardy, in a book we just finalized, has a whole chapter on risk and integration. And it is also one of these big themes. Risk, uncertainty, and and scenario building are these sort of things that the 3 working groups of the IPCC are constantly negotiating and socializing these ideas and trying to get people to use across working groups and across disciplines really broadly. Because once we add working group 2 and 3, we've got geographers, economists, very different from physical climate scientists. And so risk tends to be, it belongs to working group 2. And a lot that's for IPCC, that's impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And that is a really important translational piece, but it's distinct from uncertainty about science. And so working group 1 tends to do that. Now I know, Michael was a CLA in this SREX, which is the special report on extreme events from the IPCC. Now I think from 2013 or a while ago. And that really matured the idea of IPCC's risk assessments. But it does show up much less. They're really working. It's just a different.
Yeah. Let me say that before 2012, when the SREX report came out, there was ignorance in IPCC, I'd say, is the best description of what's the difference among risk, uncertainty, and probability. And, you know, so the working group one, I bet if you did a survey, most of them colloquially use risk to mean probability of the hazard occurring. In working group two, we spent a lot of time hammering at our definitions and, you know, to make it standardized. And since it's not, these definitions actually are not completely standardized in the various other communities that use them, it's not easy, and you have to kind of redo it every time. But I'll say IPCC's made giant strides in that direction. And part of the thing that's still open is the issue addressed in this paper of ambiguity, which reaches back to a cleavage in the definition of uncertainty, which goes back to Frank Knight, an economist in the 1920s, I guess. And that's never been resolved. And it needs, that's sort of the next frontier, is what do you do with things that can range anything from total disagreement to complete ignorance? And how do you treat that, and how do you talk about it? And since there's a lot of phenomena that are appropriately characterized in that way in the climate change business, they'll have to get their act together eventually and straighten it out. That's they did that in the there was a special report I had something to do with in 2019 on oceans and cryosphere, and it was a first attempt to bridge that gap, but it's got a long way to go.
All right, Gustavo and maybe Joyce, maybe together, and then final response.
She's covered it all.
Oh. Gustavo, go ahead.
So, well, super interesting stuff. So I have, I think, two comments / questions. Is like, one is that if you found some evidence of how they solve scientific disputes, okay? Because essentially political disputes and scientific disputes are very different. Now, if I want this and another group wants something else, so politically maybe you can reach a compromise, okay? But that's not how science works, okay? So we should develop tests to figure out if model A is right and model B is wrong, or they were wrong. So that's what scientific progress means. So did you find any instance in which they agree something like this? Okay, if by 2070 we are observing this, that means that your model is right and my model is wrong, and I will accept that. Or instances like that, or we should be collecting data on this issue because this will solve if this bunch of models are better than those ones, and after we collect data on that, we are going to crank the data and we're going to eliminate this type of discrepancy, okay? So that was one interesting, epistemological thing, okay? The second one is how they interact with outsiders. So scientific communities outside these groups, that they are maybe considering other models, alternative, the same ones, challenging the reports. So how do they interact with outsiders? And maybe the third one I will put, I promised two, but I think the third one is that something strikes me as very, very different from this compared to how science has been operating a long time. It's like the time horizons of the predictions. That's a huge difference between what we use. So usually science was, sometimes it took centuries to develop a test to try a theory or an idea or a model, okay? But at the end, you are never considering using your model for 200 years predictions. I think that's part of the problem. Any ideas on how they deal with that? Because that's a very new thing in some sense.
Okay. Yeah, I can answer some of this, and maybe Michael can help me with some of it too. These are great questions. And really, this is what my favorite thing to learn about is how they're solving scientific disputes. And so, yeah, I mean, they create new tools. One important thing is the people writing these reports, they're not doing any new research, or they're just assessing research that exists. But it's a little more complicated than that, because these folks designed some new methods to do their assessment work. And so what they do then is they're putting they're publishing the studies about their methods that they've devised having that go through the peer review system as they're doing this assessment, and then they can cite their method as something that was peer reviewed. So it is yeah, they're really busy. Somebody devised open source framework for assessing sea level rise projections. To me, that seems impossible, but one of the other authors, when I'm like, I can't believe they did that, she's like, it's not rocket science. So, I guess you can just quickly do that. So some of it was sort of technical so that they could look at this incredible array of model projections that they have and assess. But yeah, they are assessing for quality, model quality, but they have to be really careful about their own biases about what's high quality and what isn't, because we have a bunch of received wisdom in our heads about that. Yeah, and just working on the figures, I think these are really important sites that get a lot of attention in the report. And so they spend a lot of time. In science studies, they anchor, these figures are anchors that get a lot of time and attention. And so, like I said, they were so up in arms, the couple of factions, that they had to have a neutral person in their chapter who does, I think he does ocean stuff that's not sea level rise, that a non-sea level rise nice person. Everyone sort of respected and trusted to be putting it out instead of someone from faction A or faction B. Yeah, and then work on it from that. How they interact with outsiders, you mean other science groups?
Yes, I mean, maybe that, so, not the governments, you already talked about how they interact with the government.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are, it really depends on the individual or the group. Sometimes it's very much about circling up, and other times they reach out. So right now, AR7 is starting, and so they're putting out feelers to other communities, to indigenous researchers or experts, to maybe experts from disciplines that are underrepresented in IPCC reports, like anthropology. And so it really depends. And, there's a new chair, Jim Ski, he's an economist, but also sort of like a happy disruptor. And so, he's doing a lot of that, sort of outreach at this point. So that sort of refreshes. Michael, would you add to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The old expression was, of course, that the science changes one funeral at a time. And but in the global change business, as you pointed out, things change so fast. And the need for the knowledge is changing so fast. And you're still stuck with a lot of uncertainty in a lot of dimensions. But I think people are learning how to behave differently. Yeah, some of the people whose modeling results are kind of on the outside, the high end of that figure, they've come to realize some shortcomings in their work, but they're not going to give up. And it could still be, there's a 10% chance they'll turn out to be right. And but on the other hand, the demand of governments to have some sort of uniform message, not necessarily total agreement, but at least a consensus on what the disagreements are, which itself is new. And that gets back to this business of characterizing uncertainty. Don't pretend there's one very narrow bundle of answers, but be gracious and wholesome about your description of what the real uncertainties are. I think that's gone a long way to make people both a little more modest about their own claims, and at the same time being willing to do what scientists weren't so much willing to do in the past, let consensus be an emergent property of these discussions rather than accidentally, it's what popped up in the literature that a couple of people happen to agree. Now there's a process that people respect, and there's a necessity, a social necessity to get that process right. So I think we'll see both going on. We'll see people still dug in and camps of belief that's never going to change, and it's probably healthy. And at the same time, there's going to be pretty good agreement on what the central messages should be, and I hope on how to adequately characterize the indefiniteness in the central messages where it exists.
Do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
I just want to thank you. I know we are at time. I really appreciated the questions and the comments and the feedback on this. Yeah, thank you, Michael, for being here too. Yeah, so I think in AR7, this next one, IPCC is driving climate knowledge at this point. And so I think I hope that this work is useful for helping people get the process right and get the information as useful for policy as possible, and that there's more on the horizon. There are other kinds of models like integrated assessment models, coupling this physical Earth systems with economic and social models. They're a different kind of community that's a little, that is less reflective and open, and they're going to be getting a lot of scrutiny because now it's all about solving this problem. So we've got a lot on the horizon. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction and happy birthday, Jess.